Jake Turner had never quite figured out how to be a civilian again. The transition back from the war had been difficult, like a man trying to fit into a world that no longer seemed to make sense. It wasn't the foreign landscapes that threw him off. It wasn't even the constant nightmares that haunted him late at night. No, it was the disconnection, the feeling that he no longer belonged. He'd been fighting for years, fighting for the country, for something larger than himself. But now, back in his small hometown, he was just here, a stranger in his own skin. At 35, Jake was a man marked by his past. His eyes were heavy, too often distant. His broad shoulders, once forged from years of military training, now slumped under the weight of the nothingness he felt. A reminder of something he no longer understood. His hands, calloused from years of carrying rifles, now fumbled through small tasks in his rundown apartment. Nothing felt familiar. The clock on the wall ticked louder than the thoughts in his head. Jake had tried to adjust. He tried going back to school, trying to find new purpose. He had taken on odd jobs, everything from working as a mechanic to bartending at the local pub. But nothing stuck. People treated him differently now, like he was something they could never fully understand. And maybe they couldn't. Maybe Jake didn't fully understand himself anymore. This town had changed since he left too. The once quiet streets were now filled with unease. Gangs, drugs, and violence had started to creep into the small, seemingly safe community. But for Jake, it was as though everything he remembered was still in the past. People walked around like nothing had happened, acting like the world was still the same. Yet, Jake knew better. The weight of everything he'd experienced, everything he'd lost, pulled at him every day. On this particular evening, Jake decided to walk through the town. Maybe to clear his head, maybe just to feel something other than the emptiness. His boots clicked against the pavement, echoing in the stillness. The air had a chill to it, a reminder that winter was coming, though the streets were still bustling with people going about their evening routines. Young couples laughing as they walked hand in hand, old men sitting outside their favorite diner, exchanging jokes, and kids running past him on their way home from school. But it wasn't the kids or the laughter he noticed. It was the group of men loitering in front of the corner store. They were loud, boisterous, clearly not a part of the everyday flow of the town. Their clothes, baggy, dark, and filled with gang insignia, spoke volumes. This was Carlos Kingpin Rojas and his gang, the ones who had been slowly taking over the streets, with a reputation that stretched far beyond the city limits. They didn't just intimidate, they ruled. Jake knew their leader, Carlos, by reputation. He had heard the stories of Rojas's rise to power, of how he'd taken control of nearly every illicit business in town. Rojas was no stranger to violence. He thrived in it. But it wasn't just the drugs or the street fights that kept people wary of him. It was the fear he instilled, the kind of fear that spread like a disease, making everyone afraid to speak up, to act. As Jake approached the store, he overheard Carlos arguing with the elderly store owner, Mr. Alvarez. Jake recognized the man instantly, a local who had been in the neighborhood for decades. Mr. Alvarez was old school, always the first to lend a hand to those in need. But lately, he had been on edge, holding on to his business by the skin of his teeth. The gang had been eyeing his shop for weeks, demanding protection money. Alvarez had never been the type to back down, but the weight of Rojas's gang was wearing on him. "Just give us what we want, old man, and no one gets hurt," Rojas's voice rang out. He was standing at the store's door, blocking anyone from entering or leaving, his men around him like a pack of wolves. Jake stopped in his tracks, instinctively scanning the scene. He could hear the old man's voice shaking as he tried to reason with Rojas. "I've been running this store for 40 years. You're going to ruin me, my family." Mr. Alvarez's words were lost in a chorus of insults and threats from the gang members surrounding him. Jake hesitated for a moment. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't even sure what he was anymore. But he couldn't just walk away. Not this time. Not when someone was being threatened right in front of him. His military training kicked in, his instincts honed from years of keeping his comrades alive. He saw the flash of a knife in one of the gang members' hands, the tension in the air as they closed in on the terrified store owner. "Enough," Jake said, his voice deep and steady. The words didn't even feel like they were coming from him. They just happened. He stepped forward, the gang members turning to face him. Carlos Rojas eyed him up and down, the sneer on his face turning into a mocking grin. "And who the hell are you? You think you're gonna stop us?" Jake didn't respond. His body was already in motion, his instincts now fully in charge. Every move was precise, controlled. He didn't wait for Carlos to make the first move. He launched forward, disarming the closest gang member with a swift jab to the ribs. The rest of the gang quickly surrounded him, but Jake was faster. His military training gave him the edge in the fight, a calculated mix of quick reflexes, knowledge of hand-to-hand combat, and the rage he felt for what was happening to his hometown. For the first time in years, Jake felt alive. Jake's heart was pounding, but his body moved with the calm precision of someone who had fought in much worse situations. The gang members circled him, their eyes wide, but they didn't know what they were up against. Carlos Rojas, the notorious leader of this pack, was still standing at the store's door, his expression a mix of disbelief and amusement. "Who the hell do you think you are?" Rojas asked, stepping forward with a slow, deliberate motion, his hands casually tucked into his pockets. His voice was low but dangerous, the kind that promised pain if you weren't careful. Jake didn't say anything. He wasn't here for words. His training had taught him that silence could be more intimidating than threats. He didn't wait for Rojas to make the first move. He lunged, faster than anyone expected, aiming for the guy closest to him. His fist landed in the man's stomach with a thud that echoed in the cold air. The man doubled over, gasping for breath, and Jake didn't hesitate. As the guy staggered back, Jake's elbow collided with his jaw, knocking him out cold. The other gang members hesitated, but only for a split second. That was all Jake needed. He ducked under a wild punch, grabbed the wrist of the attacker, and twisted, sending him sprawling to the ground. The rest of the gang circled in tighter now, but Jake had seen this kind of fight before. He knew the rhythm of it, the way they would try to overwhelm you, come at you from every angle. He wasn't about to let them get the upper hand. One of them, a tall, muscular guy with a crooked nose, came charging at him, swinging a crowbar. Jake sidestepped just in time, using the man's own momentum to slam him into a nearby wall. The sound of the thug's body hitting the bricks was sickening, but Jake didn't stop. He grabbed the crowbar before the man could react and tossed it aside. He wasn't here to kill anyone, just to stop them, to show them that they weren't in control anymore. Carlos Rojas watched it all from the sidelines. His arms still crossed, but the look in his eyes had changed. The smugness had vanished, replaced by something darker. He clearly hadn't expected a fight like this. His gang was scattered, some members already on the ground, others backing off, unsure if they should join in or run. "You think you can take me on?" Rojas finally sneered, stepping forward, his voice now tinged with anger. He was the king of this neighborhood, the one everyone feared, and here was this ex-soldier, some nobody from out of town, taking down his men one by one. It didn't sit right with him. Jake didn't answer. He was beyond words. He wasn't a hero, not in the way they might think. He wasn't here for fame or glory. He was here because he couldn't stand seeing the town he grew up in getting swallowed by men like Rojas. The fear, the control, it was suffocating. And Jake wasn't going to let it happen any longer. Rojas took another step forward, this time pulling a knife from his belt. It glinted in the dim light, a promise of violence. "You've made a big mistake, soldier," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I don't care who you are. You don't mess with me and walk away. Not like this." Jake's muscles tensed, his body shifting into the stance he'd learned during countless drills. He didn't hesitate when Rojas swung the knife at him. He was faster. A quick move, and the blade missed his side by inches. Jake reached out, grabbing Rojas's wrist, twisting it until the knife clattered to the ground. Rojas let out a growl of frustration, but Jake wasn't finished. He shoved Rojas against the wall, the impact knocking the air out of the gang leader's lungs. "You've terrorized this town for too long," Jake growled, his voice rough. "It ends tonight." The gang leader struggled, but Jake held him there, his grip strong, steady. Rojas's face twisted with anger, his eyes wild. "You think you're a hero, don't you?" Rojas spat. "You think you can just take me down and everything will be fine? You don't know anything about power. This town belongs to me, and no one, not even you, is going to change that." Jake leaned in, bringing his face close to Rojas's, his breath hot against the leader's face. "I'm not trying to change anything, Rojas. I'm trying to save it." With one final shove, Jake sent Rojas to the ground, watching him scramble to regain his footing. The rest of the gang, seeing their leader defeated, started to back away, their bravado fading as quickly as it had appeared. The fight was over. Jake didn't take his eyes off Rojas as the gang leader staggered to his feet. There was no fear in Jake's eyes now, only cold resolve. Rojas didn't stand a chance against him, not anymore. "You get one last chance," Jake said, his voice a low, dangerous whisper. "Leave this town, now, and never come back." Rojas's eyes flicked to his remaining men, but none of them made a move to defend him. They were cowards, like everyone else in the gang. Rojas clenched his fists, seething with rage, but there was no fight left in him. Slowly he backed away, muttering curses under his breath, before turning and retreating into the night. Jake stood there, watching as the gang scattered, each of them disappearing into the shadows. His heart was still pounding, but the adrenaline had already started to fade. He could feel the weight of his body sinking into the silence that followed the fight. The street was eerily quiet now, as if nothing had happened. Jake turned toward the store owner, Mr. Alvarez, who was still standing by the door, his eyes wide in disbelief. "You okay?" Jake asked, his voice softer now, almost gentle. The old man nodded, his hands shaking. I don't know what to say. You saved me. You saved us." Jake gave a tired smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I didn't save you. I just stopped them from taking what's yours." Jake turned and started to walk away. But before he could get far, Mr. Alvarez called out to him. "Hey, wait!" the old man shouted. "What's your name?" Jake didn't stop. He didn't need to. "Jake," he called back, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just Jake." And with that, Jake Turner disappeared into the night, not looking back. The town was safe for now, but for Jake, the fight was just beginning. Jake's footsteps echoed down the dark streets as he walked away from the corner store. The adrenaline was still pumping through him, his muscles tense, but the fight was over. The satisfaction of putting an end to Rojas's reign of terror lingered for only a brief moment before reality started to set in. He could still hear the gang members yelling as they scattered, still see the fear in Rojas's eyes as he backed down. For a second, Jake felt like maybe, just maybe, he had done something meaningful. But as the night air cooled his skin, the weight of what he had just done started to feel heavier. He wasn't the man he used to be. There was no uniform to hide behind anymore, no mission to follow, no orders to take. There was just Jake, alone, walking the streets of a town that had changed too much for him to recognize. He had fought in wars that spanned across continents, but this was different. Here, on these streets, there were no clear lines between good and evil. There were only people trying to survive in a broken world. His phone buzzed in his pocket, interrupting the heavy silence. It was a text from Mia, the journalist he had briefly spoken to a few days ago. She had been following the gang activity, but tonight, she was getting more than she bargained for. "You did it. The whole town knows what you did. You took down Rojas. This is huge, Jake. You're a hero." Jake stopped in his tracks, his thumb hovering over the screen. He wasn't sure he wanted to hear that. Hero. The word sat uncomfortably in his chest. He wasn't a hero. Heroes didn't walk away from everything they'd ever known. Heroes didn't leave their brothers behind in foreign lands. Heroes didn't have the nightmares that Jake had. He was just a man who had done what needed to be done. Nothing more. "I didn't do it for the headlines," he typed back. "Just wanted to stop a bully from hurting people." The phone buzzed again almost immediately. "The town is calling you a hero. They're already spreading the story, and people want to thank you. I know it's not your style, but you need to be careful. You've made some enemies, and not just the gang. There are others out there watching. Trust me." Jake read her words and let out a sigh. Of course, there were others watching. In a place like this, the shadows ran deeper than the light. He had known what he was up against when he stood up to Rojas. But what he didn't know was how far the ripple effect would spread. One man standing up to a gang wasn't just a local issue, it was a statement. It meant things were changing, and not everyone wanted that. He shoved the phone back into his pocket and kept walking, his thoughts drifting. He couldn't shake the feeling that tonight was just the beginning. Rojas was just one part of a much larger puzzle, a puzzle he wasn't even sure he wanted to solve. But the longer he walked, the more it became clear that this fight wouldn't stay buried. It had just begun. The sound of footsteps behind him snapped him out of his thoughts. Jake didn't even flinch. His senses were still sharp, even after all the years. He had learned to trust them. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Jake kept his pace steady, but he was already preparing for the worst. He knew better than to think he could just walk away from a fight. He wasn't in the clear yet. Then a voice called out to him. "Hey man, you're Jake, right?" Jake turned slowly, eyes scanning the figure standing in the shadows. It was a young guy, probably in his early 20s. His clothes were nondescript, just a hoodie and jeans. But the way he carried himself said more about who he was. This kid was from the streets, no doubt about it. "I've heard about what you did," the kid said, a grin spreading across his face. "You put Rojas in his place. He's been running this town for too long. People respect that." Jake didn't respond immediately. He wasn't sure if the kid was here to thank him or threaten him. Either way, he wasn't in the mood for conversation. He just wanted to get home, get some rest. But the kid didn't seem like he was going to leave without talking. "Listen, I'm not with Rojas. I'm just trying to make sure people know the truth. People like you. You got a way of making things happen. People in the neighborhood, they've been talking about you all night. Word spreads fast." Jake's hand instinctively reached for the small knife he kept on him, tucked just beneath his jacket. He wasn't afraid of the kid, but he had learned a long time ago that in places like this, it was better to be ready than caught off guard. The kid must have noticed the movement. "Don't worry, man. I'm not here to cause trouble. I just wanted to say thanks. Not everyone has the guts to stand up to someone like Rojas. It's rare, you know?" Jake studied him for a moment longer. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice low. "Tyler," the kid said, shoving his hands into his pockets. "I'm from around here. I've seen how things work in this town. We need people who aren't afraid to fight back, people who aren't afraid to take control. I don't know what you're planning, but I think we could use someone like you." Jake shook his head. "I'm not here to lead anyone, kid. I'm just trying to stay out of trouble." Tyler laughed softly. "You don't get it, do you? You've already led. People are looking to you now. Whether you like it or not, you're the one who stepped up. You're the one who fought, and that's something people won't forget." Jake paused, his fingers tightening around the handle of the knife. He wasn't used to being someone's idea of a leader, especially not after everything he'd been through. But as the kid's words sunk in, a part of him couldn't help but wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was something bigger at play here. "I'm not looking for followers," Jake said quietly, "just for peace." Tyler's smile faded, and he nodded. "I get it. But peace doesn't come easy around here. Not anymore. You've made your mark. Just remember, people like Rojas, they don't just disappear. They'll be back." Jake felt the weight of Tyler's words, like a warning that echoed deeper than the kid likely realized. He turned, walking away without another word, his mind swirling with the thought that this fight wasn't over. Rojas might be gone, but there were bigger battles to fight, ones that wouldn't be settled with punches and knives. As he reached the end of the block, Jake glanced back one last time. Tyler was gone, swallowed up by the shadows. Just another face in a world that was changing faster than Jake could keep up with. But there was one thing he knew for sure now. He wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The days after the fight with Rojas felt like they stretched on forever. Yet the world around Jake seemed to move faster than he could keep up. Every step he took seemed to echo with the consequences of that one decision. People on the streets looked at him differently now, some with admiration, others with fear. Whispers followed him, whether in the grocery store or on his walks through town. "Did you hear what Jake did?" they'd say, their voices a mixture of awe and wariness. He had become a symbol, whether he wanted to be or not. He wasn't just Jake anymore. He was the guy who stood up to Rojas. At first, he hated the attention. He hadn't done it for any recognition. He had acted because he had to. The streets of his town had been overrun by violence, and someone had to stand up. Someone had to fight back. But now, it seemed like everyone was watching him. Every move, every word, weighed heavier than it ever had before. It was a Thursday evening when he found himself walking through the small park near the edge of town, his hands stuffed deep into his jacket pockets. The park had always been a quiet place, a spot where kids used to play and families gathered for picnics. Now, the swings hung empty, the rust on their chains making the silence feel even more oppressive. There were still a few people scattered around the benches, but they were mostly just walking through, keeping their heads down. As Jake passed the old oak tree, he noticed someone sitting on one of the benches. A woman, maybe in her late 30s, dressed in a dark green coat. Her face was partially hidden behind the scarf wrapped around her neck, but Jake could tell she was looking at him. The way her eyes followed him as he walked past made him stop in his tracks. He didn't know why he did it, but he turned around and walked toward the bench. She didn't make any move to get up, just stayed where she was, watching him with an almost knowing look in her eyes. "You're Jake Turner, right?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. Jake nodded slowly, his guard up instantly. "Who wants to know?" "I'm Laura," she said, pushing her scarf down just enough to reveal her face. There was something familiar about her, but Jake couldn't place it. She wasn't someone he recognized from the neighborhood, and yet, there was something about her presence that made him uneasy. "I heard what happened with Rojas," she continued, her voice quiet, but there was a definite strength behind it. "I heard you fought him off." Jake didn't answer immediately. He was still processing the fact that someone had recognized him. This wasn't the kind of place where strangers showed up out of nowhere, especially with news about gang fights. But Laura wasn't a stranger. He felt it in his bones. She was something else entirely. Maybe she was part of the reason everything in this town had started changing. Something was off. "And what's your angle?" Jake asked, his tone sharp. He had learned to be cautious, and in a place like this, you didn't get too close to people without understanding why they were there. Laura smiled, though it wasn't a smile that reached her eyes. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here because I think you're the kind of person who can help." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Help with what?" She took a deep breath, her eyes locking onto his. "The gangs, they're not going to stop with Rojas. You know that, don't you?" Jake's eyes narrowed. "I know, and I don't plan on stopping either." Laura leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a whisper, as if she was sharing a secret with him. "You don't understand. Rojas was just one small part of something much bigger. You've made a dent, sure, but that's not the real fight. The real fight is with the people who were backing him, the ones who've been pulling the strings for years." Jake felt a chill run through him. He had known the gang wasn't just about one man, but to hear it so plainly laid out in front of him felt like a punch to the gut. He didn't know what Laura meant by the ones backing him, but he had an awful feeling he was about to find out. "I don't need to hear some conspiracy theory," Jake said, his voice hard. "I've been fighting gangs for years, first in the army and now here. What you're telling me sounds like a lot of nonsense." She shook her head slowly, not offended, but resigned. "It's not a theory, Jake. It's a fact. Rojas may have been the face, but there are people far more dangerous behind him, and they won't stop until they've buried everything you've done." Jake clenched his fists, the old instincts rising to the surface again. "So, what do you want from me?" "I want you to help me take them down," she said, her eyes never leaving his. "You have a reputation now. People are looking to you for leadership. You can't just stop with Rojas. You need to keep fighting. We can't let this town fall apart because a bunch of corrupt men are making money off the suffering of everyone else." Jake's pulse quickened. He didn't know why, but he felt like he was at a crossroads. Something in Laura's words struck a chord with him, even though every part of him wanted to walk away. He had already given so much. He had fought for his country, lost friends, been broken by what he'd seen. He didn't know if he had the strength to keep fighting, not for something as abstract as justice or peace. "I'm not a leader," Jake said, his voice quieter now, almost to himself. "I'm just a guy trying to live a life without looking over my shoulder." Laura reached into her bag and pulled out a small folder. She handed it to Jake without hesitation. "Then don't look over your shoulder. Look forward. Look at what you can do now, before it's too late." Jake took the folder, his curiosity piqued, but he didn't open it right away. He wasn't ready to get pulled into something bigger than he could control, but the words still lingered, eating at him like a constant gnawing hunger. "You don't have to decide now," Laura said, standing up. "But just know this, you're not alone. There are people who want the same thing you do, people who are ready to fight for this town. You just need to make the choice. Are you willing to be part of something bigger?" Without waiting for a response, Laura turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. Jake stood there, holding the folder in his hand, his mind racing. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to do next, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't just walk away from this. The stakes had gotten too high. And whether he wanted to be part of the fight or not, it seemed like the fight had already found him. Jake stood there, the weight of the folder in his hand suddenly feeling heavier than it had moments before. He stared at the path Laura had taken as she disappeared into the night. He wanted to shake the feeling off, dismiss her words as just another pitch from someone who thought they had the answers. But something in the way she looked at him, something in the conviction of her voice, kept gnawing at him. He wasn't sure why, but he couldn't shake the idea that this wasn't just some random encounter. It was fate pulling him back into a war he thought he had left behind. The folder in his hand felt like a link to a battle he wasn't sure he was ready to fight. He'd fought for his country, fought for causes bigger than himself, and now he was being asked to do it again. Only this time, it was personal. It was his town. The same streets that had felt so small and suffocating now felt like the battleground for something much larger. Was he really prepared to walk away from the life he had built just to confront shadows he didn't even know were there? For a long moment, Jake stood there, the sounds of the town moving around him, but his world felt like it had gone silent. The weight of everything that had happened, everything that might still happen, pressed on him like a storm cloud. Finally, he exhaled deeply and opened the folder. Inside were a series of photographs, documents, and what looked like a map of the town. But it wasn't just any map. It was marked with several locations, the kinds of places where the gang operated. Jake recognized most of them, but what caught his eye was the central location, a warehouse on the edge of town, a place no one dared to approach. Laura's handwriting filled the margins of the map, detailed notes about who ran what, who was connected to whom, and the level of corruption that ran deeper than just Rojas. The photographs were more of the same, faces Jake didn't recognize, but there were some he did. Politicians, business owners, and local figures all shaking hands with men who had tattoos of gang affiliations. It wasn't just street thugs in hoodies and jackets. It was bigger, much bigger. Jake's eyes ran over the documents again, piecing together the connections. The gang had its roots in every aspect of the town: money laundering, drugs, even legal businesses. Rojas was just the front. There were others in the background pulling strings, and those strings stretched far beyond the streets. As Jake's mind absorbed the magnitude of it all, he felt something shift within him. He wasn't sure if it was the weight of responsibility or just a deep-seated anger at what was being done to his home, but he couldn't back out now. Not after what he had already done, not after what he had learned. He had been thrust into this fight, whether he liked it or not. And if he was going to finish what he'd started, he needed to know exactly who he was up against. The next morning, Jake met with Laura at the diner on the corner of Main and 3rd, the place where all the locals gathered to share news, gossip, or just grab a cup of coffee. Jake wasn't much for small talk, but today, the small booth in the back corner felt like the perfect place to figure out what the hell he was about to get involved in. Laura was already there when Jake walked in, her eyes scanning the room before locking on to him. There was no judgment in her gaze, just a quiet confidence that Jake couldn't quite place. She didn't waste time. "I'm glad you decided to look over everything," she said as Jake slid into the seat across from her. "I know it's a lot to take in." Jake nodded, opening the folder again, feeling the weight of the information pressing against his chest. "You weren't kidding," he said, his voice low. "This goes a lot deeper than just Rojas and his crew." Laura leaned in closer, her tone dropping to a near whisper. "It's not just about the street gangs, Jake. It's about the people in power, the ones who control the flow of money, the ones who keep the game going. You've seen the faces, but they're just the tip of the iceberg. I have intel that says these people are working with corrupt officials from the city. Some of them even have ties to larger crime syndicates across state lines." Jake rubbed his forehead, trying to make sense of it all. He wasn't a fool. He had always known there were bad people in power, pulling the strings. But this was different. There were no clear lines here, no obvious villains. Everyone was complicit in one way or another. "And what do you want me to do about it?" Jake asked, the words escaping him before he could stop them. Laura met his eyes, unflinching. "We need someone who knows how to move through the shadows. Someone who isn't afraid to get their hands dirty. Someone who isn't afraid to push back. You've already made an impact, Jake. People are starting to listen to you. But we can't stop here. If we want to take down the whole operation, we need to make them afraid." Jake let out a long breath, his fingers tracing the edge of his cup. He knew what she was asking him. He had already fought one battle. But this wasn't just about brawls and street fights. This was about dismantling a system that had its claws buried so deep in the town that no one could see it. "I'm not looking to start a war," Jake muttered. "I just want things to be normal again." "Normal's not an option anymore," Laura said. "This is the way it's always been, Jake. But if you're willing to stand up and make them pay, then maybe, just maybe, we can make something better out of this town." Jake sat back in his chair, the weight of her words sinking in. He wasn't sure he was ready for this. Did he really want to drag his community into this kind of fight? But the truth was, he didn't have a choice. This fight wasn't just his anymore. It was for the town that had raised him, for the people who had been afraid for too long. "I'll do what I can," Jake finally said, his voice a little more firm than before. "But you're going to have to trust me. We do this my way." Laura nodded, a glimmer of respect in her eyes. "That's all I'm asking, but know this. If we do this, there's no going back. We start pulling on those threads and everything will unravel. You'll have a target on your back, but I'm with you every step of the way." Jake's heart pounded in his chest. There was no going back now. He could feel the fight ahead of him like a storm brewing on the horizon, just waiting to break. He wasn't sure where it would lead, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let this town fall any further into the hands of men like Rojas. The road ahead was uncertain, the danger ever present. But Jake had made his choice, and whatever came next, he would face it head on. Jake barely slept that night. The adrenaline from the street fight had worn off, but it left something behind, a restlessness that gnawed at him in the quiet of his apartment. The town felt different now, the streets too quiet and the air too heavy. He hadn't realized how much he'd been avoiding it, how much he had tried to disconnect from the place he had grown up in. But now, it was impossible to ignore. He could feel the weight of the choice he had made pressing down on him. The next morning, he met with Laura again, this time in a dingy cafe tucked in a back alley near the warehouse district. The building looked like it hadn't seen a coat of paint in decades, and the air inside felt stale, but it was the perfect place to meet without anyone noticing. They were both aware of the stakes now. They were no longer just fighting a gang. They were stepping into a war against something much larger. Jake didn't sit immediately. He stood by the window, his eyes scanning the street outside, trying to shake the feeling that he was being watched. It wasn't paranoia, it was reality. Ever since his confrontation with Rojas, the gang had been active, watching their turf, making sure no one stepped out of line. He could feel the tension in the air, as if the whole town was waiting for the next move. Laura was already at a corner table, sipping a coffee, her eyes fixed on the papers spread out before her. She didn't look up when Jake walked in, but he knew she was aware of every move he made. She was sharp, too sharp to be caught off guard. "You look like you haven't slept," she said, finally glancing up at him. Her voice was calm, but there was a slight edge to it, like she could feel the weight of everything closing in. "I haven't," Jake replied, his gaze lingering on the street outside the window. "I can't get this out of my head. Rojas wasn't the end of this. It's just beginning, isn't it?" Laura nodded. "We're up against more than just Rojas's gang. He was just a pawn. The real power is hidden behind him. The people pulling the strings, they're the ones we need to take down. And we can't do it by just confronting them head on. We need to be smarter than that." Jake turned to face her, his brow furrowing. "Smarter? What does that mean?" She gestured to the papers in front of her, where a list of names was scribbled alongside various locations across the city. "These are the players, the ones who funded Rojas's operation. The ones who have their hands in everything from drug trafficking to local politics. They control the money. And where the money flows, power follows. We need to take their power away." Jake looked down at the papers, his fingers brushing against the edge of one of the photographs. A picture of a man in a sharp suit, standing next to Rojas, shaking hands with a few familiar faces from the local government. The man's face was cold, calculating, nothing like Rojas, whose bravado was always on full display. This man, however, exuded control. That's Vicente Torres, one of the biggest real estate moguls in the city. But he's more than just a businessman. He's been funneling money into Rojas's operation for years, Laura continued, her voice steady but urgent. He's the one who needs to be exposed. Take him down, and the rest will follow. Jake studied the picture, the man's smug smile gnawing at him. Vicente Torres, a man who had money, power, and influence, and who had used that to manipulate and control the very streets Jake had once called home. This wasn't just about gangs anymore. This was about systemic corruption, the kind that had existed long before Rojas ever stepped onto the scene. "So, how do we get to him?" Jake asked, leaning over the table to get a closer look at the map she had drawn out. Laura's eyes met his, the fire in her gaze unmistakable. "We hit them where it hurts. Their money, their businesses. We make them so scared, they'll have no choice but to come out of the shadows." Jake took a deep breath, weighing the words. He had been through his fair share of combat, but this was something else entirely. It wasn't just a fight, it was a battle of wits, of strategy, and it was a fight that would push him further than he had ever been pushed before. "I'm in," Jake said, his voice steady, but his pulse quickening. "What's the plan?" Laura leaned back, her hands folding in front of her. "First, we need to gather intel. Torres is a private man, but he's got his fingerprints all over the town. We need to get close to his operations. Figure out who's working for him, what deals he's making. We find that, and we can start to break him down." Jake nodded, already thinking about how to infiltrate Torres's world. He wasn't afraid of confrontation, but this wasn't going to be a simple street fight. He was going to have to be patient, clever, and most importantly, he would need to trust Laura, someone he barely knew, but who seemed to have all the answers. The next few days were a blur of meetings, surveillance, and constant strategizing. Jake found himself moving through the city with a renewed sense of purpose. He was no longer a ghost in the crowd, just another ex-soldier struggling to make a living. Now, he was part of something bigger, a force that could actually make a change. The stakes were higher than he had ever imagined, and each new piece of information they uncovered about Torres's empire only pushed them closer to a dangerous line. But nothing could prepare him for what came next. Jake had followed Torres's every move for the past week, carefully tracking his meetings, observing his routine. The man was meticulous, always surrounded by bodyguards and never staying in one place for too long. He had eyes everywhere, and Jake had to be careful, biding his time. That night, everything changed. Jake received a tip from an inside source, one of Torres's lower-level employees who had gotten cold feet and wanted out. They met in a small alley, the smell of damp concrete heavy in the air. The source was shaky, nervous, but he had information that could blow everything wide open. "They're planning something big, something huge," the man said, glancing over his shoulder as if someone might be watching. "Torres isn't just involved in the city's business. He's got a deal in the works, a major drug shipment coming in next week, and he's moving it through the docks. I don't know the details, but I know it's big." Jake's eyes narrowed as he took in the information. This was it, the break they had been waiting for. If they could intercept the shipment, it would not only destroy Torres's operation, but send a message to everyone connected to him. "Where?" Jake asked, his voice low and sharp. The man hesitated, but Jake pressed him. "Where is it going down?" "The docks, Monday night. Torres himself will be there." Jake didn't hesitate. He had the information they needed, and now it was time to act. The night of the shipment felt like it was stretching toward infinity. Jake had been planning for this moment for days, piecing together every bit of intel Laura had gathered. The docks were a maze of rusted metal and darkened alleys, a place where secrets were traded, and lives could disappear without a trace. It was the perfect spot for Vicente Torres's operation to remain hidden, away from prying eyes. But tonight, the darkness wouldn't protect him. Jake had gathered a small crew, some of the locals who had been affected by Torres's control, others who had simply had enough. Together, they were going to hit the docks, shut down the shipment, and send a clear message. Torres wasn't untouchable. The air was thick with mist as Jake moved through the shadows, the distant hum of the city fading behind him. He had worked his way through worse situations in the army, but this felt different. This wasn't about foreign enemies or orders from above. This was personal. It was about the future of his town, the people he grew up with, and the chance to finally put an end to Torres's grip on everything. Laura was with him, of course. She had been a constant presence through every step of this plan. While Jake worked the ground, keeping his eyes peeled, Laura had been in the background, coordinating their moves, feeding them intel, keeping them ahead of Torres's people. She was as sharp as a tack, and Jake had come to rely on her instincts, even if he hadn't fully understood all of her connections. But now wasn't the time to question it. Tonight, everything would come together. They reached the edge of the docks, the concrete gritty beneath their boots, the low glow of streetlights casting long shadows over the water. The cargo ship that was supposed to unload the shipment was anchored, the silhouette of its hulking form barely visible in the fog. Torres would be there. Jake could feel it. He wasn't going to let this one slip by. Laura signaled, her hand held out, waiting for Jake to give the signal. They had timed everything down to the second. Any mistakes tonight, any missteps, and they risked everything. "Get in position," Jake muttered, his voice barely audible as he crouched low behind a stack of shipping containers. The crew split up, positioning themselves at key points around the docks, ready to move in as soon as the shipment began unloading. Jake's mind was racing. He could already hear the faint sounds of movement, voices from across the dock, the thrum of the engines on the boat. Torres's men were setting up for the transfer. The moment was almost here. Jake glanced over at Laura, her face illuminated in the dim light as she observed the scene through binoculars. She was poised, ready to give the go-ahead. And when the moment came, there would be no turning back. This was it, the culmination of everything they had fought for. Then, the first movement came. The cargo doors on the boat began to open, and Jake's heart rate kicked into overdrive. Torres's men were unloading crates. Jake couldn't see what was inside them, but he didn't need to. He knew exactly what they were: drugs, weapons. The very things that had torn this town apart for years. The money flowing from these shipments had corrupted everything and everyone in its path. Without a word, Jake and his team moved. They approached from the left and right, making sure they stayed out of sight. The element of surprise was key. Torres had no idea what was about to hit him. As they closed in, the loud thud of footsteps echoed in the distance, the sound of men moving in, their boots clanging against the hard pavement. Jake's hand tightened around the gun he carried, ready to take control of the situation. This had to end tonight. "Now," Laura's voice came through Jake's earpiece. It was calm, but there was an edge to it that he knew meant it was time to act. Jake gave the signal, and in an instant, his crew stormed the docks. The shouts of surprise from Torres's men filled the air as they scrambled to respond. But it was too late. Jake and his team had already breached the perimeter. The sound of gunfire rang out, sharp and quick, as Jake moved with purpose, taking out the first man who came at him. He didn't hesitate. He didn't flinch. This wasn't a street fight, it was a war. The battle raged for a few minutes, loud and chaotic, as men in dark clothing scattered, trying to defend themselves, but Jake's crew was too well coordinated. They had been training for this moment, each of them knowing their role. Torres's men were disorganized, caught off guard by the ambush. The fight didn't last long, and then there was silence. The chaos had quieted. The only sounds left were the ragged breaths of Jake's team and the distant hum of the water lapping against the docks. Jake scanned the area, his eyes moving across the scene. Several of Torres's men were down, some knocked out, others taken prisoner. But where was Torres? The answer came a few moments later when a figure emerged from the shadows, his face hard and angry. Vicente Torres. He had been hiding in one of the nearby shipping containers, but now he was standing in the open, his eyes blazing with fury. "You think you've won, huh?" Torres spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You think this is over? You don't know what you've started." Jake took a step forward, his eyes never leaving Torres. "It ends tonight," he said, his voice low but steady. "You've been running things here for too long. This town doesn't belong to you?" Torres sneered, his hand twitching as if to reach for something. Maybe a weapon, maybe just for control. But Jake was faster. Before Torres could make a move, Jake had him pinned to the ground, his knee pressing against the gangster's chest. "You don't get to control anything anymore," Jake muttered, looking down at the man who had terrorized this town for so long. Behind him, Laura moved forward, her eyes scanning the rest of the scene. The men Torres had sent to protect the shipment were either captured or on the run. The docks, once a dark symbol of fear, were now empty, cleared of the men who had been its rulers. But as Jake held Torres down, he felt the weight of the situation crash down on him. This wasn't just about taking down a gang leader. This was about everything: the system of corruption, the web of deceit that had held this town hostage. The man beneath him was only one part of a much larger puzzle. and Jake knew that knocking down Torres was only the beginning. "This town's ours now," Jake said quietly, his words final. Torres snarled, but there was nothing left in him. Jake knew it. He could feel it. This fight was far from over, but the victory tonight was a turning point. For the first time in years, Jake felt like he had a chance to make things right. The town was changing, and so was he. And as the sun began to rise over the docks, the faint light hitting the water, Jake stood tall, knowing that the war wasn't won yet. But this was a start. Jake stood above Torres, the man's chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath, his anger still evident in his eyes. The docks were a mess, broken crates, discarded weapons, and the bodies of Torres's men scattered on the ground. It was over, at least for tonight. Jake didn't know what would come next, but he knew the people who had been pulling the strings for so long were going to feel the pressure. He looked up, his eyes scanning the scene. The sounds of sirens were starting to wail in the distance, but it wasn't just the police that had arrived. It was the last piece of the puzzle. The truth was about to spread through the streets like wildfire. Torres, Rojas, and the men who had terrorized the town for so long, they were only one part of the system. Now, it was time to bring down the rest of it. Laura approached, her boots clicking against the concrete as she came to a stop beside Jake. She didn't say anything at first, just looked down at Torres, who was still seething beneath Jake's knee. Her eyes shifted to Jake, assessing him, and then she gave a small nod. She had seen what Jake had done. She knew this was just the beginning. "You did it," she said, her voice steady. "But we're not finished." Jake's jaw tightened. "I know." For the first time in days, the weight that had been sitting on Jake's chest, the suffocating uncertainty about what was going to happen next, felt lighter. They had taken down Torres's shipment, exposed his ties to local politicians, and sent a message to the gang. But what Laura was saying wasn't just about taking out one player, it was about dismantling everything Torres had built. "I've got a plan," Laura continued, pulling a small notebook from her jacket pocket. "We've hit Torres tonight, but the real target is still out there. We've got connections to the city council, big players behind the scenes. It's not just about the drugs and the money, it's about breaking down their grip on this town." Jake listened, his eyes narrowing as she laid out the next steps. They would need to gather more intel, meet with people on the inside, and use the network they had built over the past week. This was a chess match, and Torres was only one piece. They needed to take out the rest, but there was something in Jake's gut that told him this wasn't just about strategy anymore. It wasn't about the next move or the next hit. It was about everything, about the very soul of this town, the people who had suffered for too long, and the fight that he was now a part of. The sirens were getting louder now. Jake stood, letting Torres go as he slowly stood up, wiping the grime from his hands. Torres, still spitting mad, glared at him, but Jake didn't care. He wasn't there for Torres. He wasn't even there for the gang. He was there for everyone else. Jake walked toward Laura, his mind already racing ahead to what needed to come next. "What happens now?" "We move fast," she said. "We expose them all. We take away their ability to control this town. We make sure everyone knows who they really are." Jake looked over his shoulder, seeing Torres being cuffed and hauled away by one of his men. Torres was still angry, still defiant, but there was fear behind that anger now, a fear that hadn't been there before. For the first time, he knew he wasn't invincible. He wasn't untouchable. Jake turned his attention back to Laura. He knew what had to happen. He had always known, but now it felt real. The town would either rise up and join them, or they would fall. Either way, Jake wasn't going anywhere. He had been through too much, had lost too much, to walk away now. "I'm in," Jake said, his voice calm but firm. "Let's finish this." Laura smiled slightly, her eyes glinting with determination. "We're just getting started." The next days were a blur. Jake found himself pulling strings, getting information, making moves he never thought he'd have to make. He worked with the police, who had started to take a genuine interest in what was happening, though they were still hesitant to move against the real criminals. And he worked with the community, some of whom were scared, others who were ready to rise up with him. The evidence began to pile up. Corrupt officials in the city, business owners who had been laundering money, and politicians who had been accepting bribes from Torres and his associates. The fight was bigger than Jake had ever imagined, but the town was ready. They had seen the change, the power that had been in the hands of people like Torres, and they were done. Then came the final blow, the moment when everything clicked. A meeting, carefully planned, where Jake and Laura would confront the last of the hidden power brokers, the people who had been pulling the strings. Jake had learned their names, their connections, everything they needed to bring them down. The plan was set, the trap was laid. It wasn't about vengeance anymore. It wasn't about making them pay for the harm they had caused. It was about giving the town its power back, about showing everyone that the fight wasn't over, that things could be better if they took control of their own future. The night of the meeting arrived, and Jake stood in front of the group of men and women who would help bring it all to an end. He wasn't a soldier anymore. He wasn't fighting a war overseas. But the battle in front of him felt just as important. This was his town, his fight, and he would see it through to the end. End of story.